Hi there, I'm Robin Koman. Thanks for coming out today for my talk, 10 UI tips to help your game work for aging gamers. Now, since you're here, you're probably open to the idea that older adults are a legitimate audience to target for video games. If you need some convincing, let's begin this talk with a few whys. So, number one, if you're a game developer, you're probably familiar with the ESA, or the Entertainment Software Association. Every year, they release this great document called the ESEA Essentials, where they basically look at all the games that are rated by the ESRB and give us some statistics. As of 2021, the ESA Essentials report that 28% of the people playing games are adults over the age of 45, and only 20% are kids under the age of 18. So now we know there are more adults over the age of 45, and technically older adults begin at 50, but 45 is right on the cusp. And so knowing this, hopefully opens our mind right to the idea that they're an audience that we should target. Another why, the American Association of Retired Persons, or the AARP, had some research conducted by Nelson Kukula and found in 2019 that adults over the age of 50 spent over $3 billion on video games. So we know there are lots of older adults playing games, and they're spending lots of money on games. And so obviously we want to target them. Since that's the case, we have to understand how to make our games accessible for older adults. There are natural aging changes that happen as we get older, changes to our vision, to our hearing, to our motor control, and to our cognitive processes. The good news is that a well-designed UI can actually compensate for some of those changes and make games more playable. So we'll begin with tip number one: use contextual and high contrast iconography. So what does this mean? Well, icons are images that represent some kind of functionality, right? They're usually a part of a pop-up, or they're an element of our HUD. That iconographic imagery should be high contrast to make it very legible to adults with vision changes. In addition to making it high contrast, we should also make sure that the icons are contextually significant, both to the gameplay, to the world that the game is set in, but as well as hopefully contextually significant to the audience we're trying to hit. So a great example of this is from a game called Mutazione, from a company called Da Guti Fabrik. And in this game, when it's saving, they use a cassette tape icon on screen. It's a little small, it's not as high contrast as I would like, but it is a very known functionality to any Gen Xer or baby boomer that grew up with cassette tapes, right? And so just a charming little way to reinforce saving in a familiar way. In addition to that, they also have these contextual pop-ups that occur to let you know what kind of interaction you're capable of in a given part of the environment. There's a hand when you can pick something up. There's an eye when you can look at something. There's a speech bubble when you can talk to a character. And so it's all very high contrast, all very straightforward to support both visual needs, but also some cognitive processing needs that would be beneficial for older adults. Tip number two: use plain mixed case font. And so with the vision changes that happen as we age, if you make this choice, if you use this tip, you're basically going to create a more legible, readable font that's going to cause less eye fatigue and strain. Another factor along with making it plain and mixed case is to look at the size of the font. And so thankfully there are some guidelines for this. For computers, you have the Web Accessibility Checker and guidelines that you can refer to, and mobile device manufacturers as well as console manufacturers have guidelines for different styles and sizes of font that you might use to make your applications more accessible. Another way to make your font in terms of the visual side of things more accessible to your audience is by allowing for customization of size and color. And so basically put the control in the player's hands. Let them choose how high contrast the font is going to be. Let them choose how large the font needs to be. Now, this does mean that you're going to have an adaptable user interface design. You may or may not have the time and resources to make that happen, but even if you could just offer a series of presets like they do in the game The Almost Gone, of different sizes, that would certainly go a long way toward helping this audience. On the cognitive processing side, I do want to mention anytime you're offering customization, be sure to have a revert to default option. The player base that you would be targeting has probably not played a lot of games, because frankly, there aren't a lot of games that offer really robust customization of font size and color in the user interface. And so when you're offering a novel situation, it takes longer to get used to it and longer to remember sort of the core functionality. And so to reduce that burden, if you just offer a reset to default, they don't have to remember what the original version was. They can just change back to it. So tip number 4, make interactive points easy to target. Basically here, we're talking about motor control changes that come with age paired with vision changes. These two things conspire to make it challenging to hit small targets accurately and quickly. So if there's a tiny little X or a teeny button or a tiny arrow that I'm trying to hit, or if I'm moving between two different parts of the screen, it can be challenging for me to do that quickly and accurately. So make these elements more forgiving. Give a little buffer around them that's also interactive. Increase their size to make them easier to target. When there are multiple elements that have to be interacted with, put them into closer proximity with one another so that the player doesn't have so much effort to move between them. Basically, what we're looking to do with this tip is to avoid the frustration that comes along with misclicks and mistaps. So tip number 5, we've talked about vision a bit and even a little bit on cognition and motor control. So let's talk about auditory elements that we can adjust to make things more accessible. So tip number 5, allow sound types to be adjusted independently, is looking at a couple of things. So generally there's a body of hearing changes that occur as we age called presbycusis, and those make it challenging for the player to hear with the same sensitivity they would have when they were younger. And so if we allow the player finer control, where they can adjust music distinctly from sound effects, distinctly from dialogue, if we can create that kind of functionality, it basically allows them to tune the auditory experience to them. Having a globally reduced volume can actually negatively impact directionality, kind of the understanding of where things are coming from. And obviously that could affect gameplay, make it harder to respond properly. In addition to volume being an issue, tip number 6 encourages us to take care with sound frequency and speed. And so in addition to volume causing these issues of direction discernment and gameplay responses, older adults typically lose sensitivity to higher frequency sounds as they age. And so when we use those higher frequency sounds, it causes a similar determination of directionality issue. It also causes issue on what I call filtering. So it becomes more challenging to filter voices over background noises, for an example, or people who are speaking over repetitive sounds or other people talking. High-speed speech has also been shown to cause problems in terms of missed content and misunderstandings. So in addition to allowing for that tuning that we talked about, think about having a menu option to control speed of speaking or speed of delivered dialogue. You might also pair this with a visual, obviously, like closed captioning. So tip number 7, allow control of pacing, including text advancing. So we mentioned already, right, motor control declines, and that can impact reflexes and endurance. When you pair that with some cognitive shifts in processing, that can lead to changes in focus as well as in response times. Now, game UIs can compensate for this by allowing players some HUD or menu options to control how fast things are happening, to relax timing burdens, to pause timers or turn them off altogether. Also allow players to control text advancement versus having text being set to auto scrolling. Another way you can help here is with difficulty modes that reduce the speed at which players have to pick up new mechanics. So sort of global slow of pacing would also be helpful. Tip number 8, allow players to pause cutscenes. And so this is another way that we can compensate for aging changes. Let the player pause, rewind, fast forward cutscenes, especially if there's going to be spoken dialogue and or the use of closed captioning that's auto scrolling. Not only does this help with issues in and around cognitive processing and auditory processing, but it also gives a player the power to create a little break for themselves. And so they can pause and kind of catch their breath. This is helpful with endurance and fatigue. Also allows them to kind of manage the intensity that they're feeling in relationship to the gameplay they've been experiencing and what they're about to experience. So overall, a useful trick. Tip number 9, support memory with journals or objective lists. So if you're a game designer, you probably know how pervasive the introduction, practice, mastery pattern is to the craft of game design. As we age, we need more time for things to get from short-term memory to long-term memory. In addition, when something is a part of that long-term storage, it is easier for us to recall older content from that long-term storage than newer content from that long-term storage. So the implication here, obviously, is that we need more time with introduction and practice before we should be expected to master something when we're an older adult player, especially if the kind of game we're playing is new or novel to us. But with that issue in long-term storage, where, again, we pull from older long-term storage easier than newer long-term storage, even if we've had a bit of time for introduction and practice, if we have a gap in gameplay where we don't use certain mechanics, we may have to be introduced to those again before we can expect the player to actually perform well at a mastery level with those mechanics. One of the ways that we can compensate for the sort of pattern of tasks that the player is responsible for is by giving them a journal that accounts for what they've done up until that point and would give them hints as to what they've learned up until that point, perhaps jog the memory. If you don't think a journal is appropriate to your type of game, another option is an objective list. That objective list would ideally include categories such as new objectives, objectives that are in progress, and those that have been completed, again, just to support needs of memory. Tip number 10, allow for the use of assistive devices. So some players are going to need special technology to make your game accessible, whether it's on mobile or PC or console. There are a variety of adaptive devices that can be used to accommodate for motor, vision, hearing, and other accessibility issues. Develop in such a way that players can actually make use of that tech and advertise the fact that your game has been designed to allow for the use of that technology. Make it easier for players to find games that will allow them to use the devices that they depend on. So, bonus tip, include older adults as playtesters for your game. Less than 5% of the game industry are adults over the age of 50. So if you want to make games accessible for older adults, make sure you include them in your field of playtesters. Like any other aspect of a game's design, UI can be prototyped and play tested and should be early and often in your game development process, whether that's through paper prototypes or playable wireframes that you create in a tool like Adobe XD. Get your UI into the hands of older adult players. Thank you so much for coming out for this talk. And if you'd like to reach out to me with any questions or comments, you can reach me at my website or on Twitter or on LinkedIn as well. Have a wonderful rest of Siege. Thank you.